My name is Renato. I am head of development at N. I come from a little town in Italy. This is called Vicenza. We are known for our passion for cats. Ask me more about that later. I'm very keen to know about your cats. And I've been working on Magento 2 for a couple of years, much more for on Magento 1. And tonight I'm going to talk about code quality. So what is the challenge? The challenge is keeping the code consistent on a style perspective and up to date with current standards across a team that grows or has a high turnover on evolving agile projects. So up to date, I'm saying up to date because we started working on, recently we saw Magento 2.0, which supports PHP 5.6 and 7, then Magento 2.1, then Magento 2.2. Soon Magento 2.3 will drop the compatibility with PHP 7. So we have a platform that evolves, but also a language that evolves. We need to and with the language, also the coding standards will evolve. So that's an important thing, and it changes with the years. It's not like you learn to code in C in 1990, and then the same code is working in 2012, maybe. So that's a complexity, and there is also a team. You're working on a team that can grow. In our case, we started 3 years ago. It was like 2 of us. Now it's 10 only in the Magento team. Or maybe an agency could have a good turnover. And you have different people. And every person will have their own code style, their own experiences. So everyone writes code in their own way. And of course, there is the agile perspective as well. So you need to add features quickly, you need to fix a bug, and so on. So that's the challenge. And what are the enemies in that challenge? So quick fixes, you need to fix a bug on the checkout, we all know about that. And we have a urgent feature that needs to be done by tomorrow or by yesterday. And by that, we end up developing code that should be temporary, but ends up being permanent. And it doesn't happen only to our world. We know that it's kind of a human attitude. That's one of my favorite quotes. So, you put up, imagine to be in California, you put your Python booth on and, your foot expands because it's really hot, and then you cannot get it off. And then a week went by, I think it was most like a month or so. Like you said a week, but it was more definitely. And you get it off, and you have stink foods. That's what happens. So don't let your code stink. Take care of it before it's too late. What can you do? You can develop unit tests, but that's more on a bug point of view. So you try to avoid breaking things inadvertently. So regressions, and also if you have to build a test while you're developing, you start from the beginning thinking at what could go wrong instead of just getting to the point and releasing it. Another thing is performing code reviews. That's more on the code styling, which should be consistent and also adhere to best practices. So why is that difficult? It's difficult because code reviews, in this particular case, I'm not talking about unit tests in this moment, but code reviews are often repetitive because most of the code you read will be probably like public function, private function, and all that, which can make them boring. And also, you might do a code review one day and you're in a rush, and so you speed it up and you end up approving stuff that shouldn't have been approved. And other days, well, because we're human, right? So we have deadlines. Other days you can maybe be more thorough. So one day a code review might be better, one day it could be worse. And we're humans part 2 is that when you give a feedback to a developer, it can take it personally, like, oh, you don't like how I work, while instead you tend just to make some rules to be like enforced. So it's a tough job. So how can we make it easier? What I say is, let's automate everything, especially if it's boring. I'm sure someone else said that before me. Not everything can be automated. For instance, okay, you can automate a check that the object manager is not used directly, apart from maybe factory classes. You can automate that. What you cannot automate is like the approach to the solution. It could be totally wrong. And that part has still to be manual. But there are other parts that can be automated. And this way, if you do that, you're more efficient and you enjoy your job more because you do what you actually like to do instead of just looking at the same stuff every day. So just a bit of an overview, like where do we start? On Magento 2, there are 2 approaches on developing customizations. And one is write your extension under app code. The other is use vendor and put your modules over there. In theory, what is advised is put verticalization, so something that is specific to a project inside app code, and put something that you want to distribute under vendor. What we do at end, and I'm sure a lot of other people will do as well, agencies and other vendors and other merchants, is put everything under vendor, and every bit of code made it modularized. So each package has its own function. If you have a package that depends from another package, you still have an identified functionality for that and another identified functionality for the other, even if it's only for your own e-commerce or for a specific project. This makes testing a lot easier because you narrow the scope of each functionalities. When you make a change to a module and not to a whole like shop. And of course, you make everything more agile. So from here, we start talking about continuous code quality control. So what I want to suggest is to apply it to every single module by itself, run it after every single commit. This is, it works very nicely with Git flow. So if you have a Git flow kind of workflow or something that looks like it, you will like start developing a functionality by making a branch of master, work on that branch. When it's ready, when your functionality is ready, you will be able to, you will do a commit, push it, and when it's there, it can be reviewed. First automatically, if it passes the automatic test, it can be reviewed manually as well. And after that, it can pass QA and then be merged to the main or to the feature branch. So this is kind of like the overall workflow. So in this pipeline, we have several steps. There are 3. Just I don't want to spoil the surprise, but there are 3. I put phpcs first. There is no actual reason to put one or the other first. It's just, it can make sense to do it this way. So first of all, phpcs. It's a code sniffer. It just picks a set of rules and checks the code against them. What rules? Well, it's a configuration file, and luckily for us, Magento provides configuration files for Magento 2 and Magento 1. So you can just check the second repository and use those rules together with phpcs to validate your code. Those rules are the same that Magento applies to every module you might want to submit to the marketplace. So if your code doesn't pass that test, it will never be accepted to the marketplace. So maybe if your code doesn't pass the test, you don't even want it to be on your custom Magento shop. So how does it work? Well, it's quite simple. You just check out the repository, then you run phpcs. You specify the list of folders that your module has, because it could be, in this case, we have API block model test. You might have controller maybe, you might have, setup and so on. So over there, the standard is specified. So it actually automatically picks the standard inside of the marketplace EQP set of rules, picks what standard you want to test. It's going to be MEQP1 if you're on Magento 1. That's very verbose, the first kind of set of rules. If you set the severity level to 10, it's going to be a lot drier, and you are going to get what actually like Magento will see if you try to submit your extension to their marketplace. Okay. This is an example output. This is what kind of thing you might get. So your variable name is too short or too long. Sometimes you need to call variables that way. So you can use some annotation to suppress the warnings you have assessed that you actually need to bypass. Okay. For instance, underscore construct doesn't respect the guidelines, but you have to override that method to initialize a model. So, I mean, you cannot do without it. Second step is phpMD, which is mess detector. A bit like before, but without a set of rules. So it's all embedded. You specify the list of folders you want to run it against, and it will just work. On a pipeline, you might want to just keep them as warnings and not block the pipeline, so you can use the flag to ignore validations. Otherwise, it will like return a negative exit code, and you won't be able to execute the rest of the pipeline. This is an example of an output. It's a bit more detailed. As you can see, variable length is still a problem, but also it will tell you that, for instance, you've declared a variable and you haven't used it. So it's a bit more detailed. And also, in this case, you can use annotation to suppress warnings. For instance, this one in specific is like unused formal parameter. So you specify a parameter in the function signature, but let's say you are extending an interface or another class, and you cannot omit that parameter. So you don't need it. So you want to ignore the warning. Step 3 is unit tests. So, well, I guess if you know what a unit test is, you know how to run it. So there is like an example of how to execute the test. And the last command is how to execute PHP unit tests with an output that is the Clover file. And we will talk about that later. But basically, if you have Xdebug enabled, you can run it, and it will keep track of what lines of code have been executed or not during the tests. And this will allow other tools to display what percentage of your code you're actually testing and what percentage of your code you're not testing. This is an output. I guess it's the most common amongst the two we spoke about today. So 52 tests have been executed, 100% went through. You can ignore some functions. For instance, if you're developing a module, you might not want to test the setup script, because it's kind of pointless. So in the example, I used Travis CI, which is free for open source project, and Magento 2 uses in the official repository. There are other alternatives like Jenkins, like Bitbucket pipelines. And well, this is a configuration. I will make the slides available. There's really no point of going into much detail, but it's just install the dependencies and then run the 3 commands that I showed you before. It's really basic. This is what you see on the Travis CI kind of panel. You see the list of the tasks with a list of the output, like the same that you would see in any other kind of tool. Other tools that I want to quickly show to you are Coveralls and Code Climate. They just pick up your code and give you some other insight. Coveralls, in my example, just picks up the Clover file that I mentioned earlier from PHP unit tests and show you some graphs. So for instance, in this case, it will show like what is your code coverage, your test coverage in time. So it's 19% in this example. It was less before, it went up a bit. Then you can scroll down a bit in the dashboard and you can see for each file how many lines are covered and how many lines are not. And for each build, if the percentage went up or down. Then you can take a look at the code view, which actually show you the specific lines that are covered and or not. So this is, for instance, a command line class. Code Climate is another interesting tool. It works in a different way. It can pick up the Clover file, but it can also be executed by the pipeline, by like the CI tool directly into the to the code, and also on your local machine. So this is a sample configuration, and what you can see is, compared to before, you can see the code coverage, the test coverage, but you can also see the maintainability, which is an interesting score given based on some rules that they have. Again, these 2 tools are free for open source extensions, so you might want to give it a try. They are kind of expensive for your own projects, but this kind of maintainability score is an interesting KPI. It's based on a list of criterias like argument count, complex logic, file length, that you might want to keep track of. So it could be interesting to integrate and to evaluate.